everywhere from Washington, D.C. to Brussels to Moscow, everyone is trying to figure out how this Russia-Ukraine war is going to come to an end. All parties seem to come to the conclusion, and throw Kyiv into that the war is going to be over. The war is going to come to a negotiated settlement pretty soon. The big question, though, is how is it going to be resolved? And who's going to come out a winner? Who's going to come out a loser? And just what are the outlines going to look like? Well, one of the big questions that needs to be answered is President Trump supporting Ukraine, or is he abandoning Ukraine? It's an important question to ask because a lot of people are asking, making the claims on both sides of that simultaneously. We're going to try to delve in today to find out, is there any truth to either one of them, and what is the ground truth? And who better to help us unpack that than the great Alexander Mercouris, co-host of the Duran on the YouTube channel, and just an incredible man. So welcome back to the show, and we're grateful to have you on today.
Thank you very much, Daniel. It's a great pleasure to be on the show.
Truly, it's great to have you on here because you have such a way, and I guess it's your lawyer trained mind that's can peer through a lot of the stuff on the surface and get through the emotions to actually see the fundamentals under the seaside, and that's one of the things we want to exploit a little bit today. So let's start off with the Trump part of this equation first, because at a meeting earlier this week, he basically said when the president of France was here, they had a press conference and some cameras were rolling in the Oval Office, and Trump indicated that this thing's going to be over probably within weeks.
I think we're working in soon.
How soon?
Within weeks.
Weeks?
Yeah. Don't you think so? I'd like to ask, I think we could end it within weeks if we're smart. If we're not smart, it'll keep going and we'll keep losing young, beautiful people that shouldn't be dying. And we don't want that. And remember what I said, this could escalate into a third world war. And we don't want that either.
Yeah, we don't want that at all. We don't even want this current war to go on, much less World War III. But let me just ask you, we'll just keep it on that topic for the moment. What do you make of his comments that we're going to get this over with, and implying it with confidence that he must have some idea what the end state's going to look like within weeks?
Well, I personally don't think it can be ended within weeks. I think this is a very, very complex problem. It's built up over many, many, many years. There are strong emotions on each side. There's major conflicts of interest. The Russians have their perspective. The Ukrainians have their perspective. The Europeans have their perspective. It's impossible in practical terms to bring all the pieces together and to get a peace done within weeks. And I think, and this is a view that, I've been in negotiations many times, I think that harping on this point risks communicating the wrong message to some of the parties, including, by the way, the Russians, which is that it gives the impression that Trump is anxious to get a peace and to get it quickly. And because he's anxious, he might make concessions which perhaps he wouldn't otherwise make in order to get that peace done fast. And some people, and I include the Russians here, might decide that they can take advantage of that. So I don't think peace can be achieved within weeks, but I think you can take steps towards achieving peace within weeks. And I think if we put aside some of the language, some of the things that Trump has been saying, and Trump's been saying many, many things, and some of them are, contradict each other, if I have to, or not fully consistent with each other. If we look at what he has done, instead of what he sometimes says, then we can see a direction. And firstly, he is talking about peace. He is looking to end the war. This is an advance from what we had a few weeks ago when Biden was still president, when nobody seriously was talking about ending the war. So that is a step forward. Secondly, he's finally broken this policy of not communicating with the Russians. We now have proper communications with the Russians. We've had a telephone call between the Russian and American presidents. We've had a meeting between the Russian and American foreign ministers, apparently a good meeting. We've had a follow-up meeting in Istanbul which is all about setting up embassies and getting communications going. And well, hopefully at some point, all of this will come together and we will get some further progress. But forward movement there is, but it's not going to be sorted in a few weeks.
Now, this is Gary's showing on the screen right now. That soundbite I just showed you was from Emmanuel Macron. He was sitting right next to him when he made those comments. But now here, there's Keir Starmer. We don't have any sound from that yet. We're going to still wait to see. But as far as you understand from watching the British media, what is his objective to try to get? What's he going to try to either get Trump to do, or what is Trump going to try to get him to do?
Well, what the British want to do, and I mean, they're quite clear about this, is that they want to bring Ukraine into NATO. They're completely unreconciled to any agreement, peace settlement, such as the Russians would.
Wait, I'm sorry.
With.
Did you say that they're still trying to get Ukraine into
Oh, yes.
NATO?
Absolutely. I mean, the British policy, as expressed by Starmer in several telephone calls to Zelensky, is that Ukraine is still on an irreversible course towards NATO. So what they want to do is they want to get peacekeeping troops, which means British, French, European troops into Ukraine. They want the United States to provide a guarantee for that. They want that guarantee ultimately to be extended to Ukraine itself. When they talk about a guarantee, they mean something very close to an Article 5 guarantee. And eventually they hope that that guarantee will become, in fact, a proper Article 5 guarantee. Now, that is the British policy. I think it's completely unrealistic. I think it's wildly dangerous. I think, as the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said, if its effect, if it was successful, would be to prolong the war. But this is what the British are up to. And I think people in Washington, the president specifically, who has said that, NATO is off the table, needs to understand that. The British, to some extent, and, we have to be honest about this also, are looking beyond President Trump. They say he's going to be there for 4 years, but perhaps if we can get the troops in, the British troops, the French troops in, if we can wait out Trump, if we can get these guarantees.
Okay, help me understand something. What is the drive and the motivation for the UK or Europe, if it can be expanded that far? But we'll just stick with the UK since that's where you are and you know it the best. Yeah. What is the motivation to want to try and get that, as opposed to just get this war off the table as soon as possible and then get back to trying to, have some kind of solid relations? What is the value of having troops on the ground, Ukraine in any form, vice the one I just described?
Well, this is a fundamental difference between American perspectives, at least current American perspectives, and European ones, because Donald Trump is talking about the priority being to create peace in Ukraine, to bring this war to an end. For the Europeans, their ultimate priority is different. And you only have to listen to all the European leaders, Friedrich Merz, Emmanuel Macron, and all the others, and of course Starmer, to understand that. Their priority is to preserve the Western alliance as it has been, and to keep the United States in Europe, and to maintain a situation where the United States feels it must remain in Europe in order to confront Russia. So they don't want just peace. They want a peace very much on their terms.
Okay. Now, I would disagree with that, but that's irrelevant. That's my opinion. They can have their opinion. It's fine. Yeah. But let's just agree that what you described is an accurate representation of their opinion. That's what they want to accomplish. Yeah. If you're a wise person and just of adequate mental capacity, you should be able to look and say, okay, whether you think you can wait out Trump for 4 more years, I mean, the likelihood is that his vice president, if they're successful, will probably follow on. So there might not be any change. But in any case, 4 years is a long time. Trump is not going to go down that path. Even in that clip I just showed you, he's wanting to avoid World War III. So he's not going to support anything going down that path. Secondly, and maybe more important, looking at the battlefield, continues to crumble for the Ukraine side. And anyone with military knowledge should understand that it can never be recovered in our lifetimes. It's going to take generations to recover the military capacity. Forget about money or anything else. It's not about that. You have to rebuild the human capital, which has been devastated, and it will take many, many years to recover. So you may want that outcome, but two of the major inputs are prohibiting that from having a much of any realistic view, but yet they still stay on there. Make that make sense for me.
Well, it doesn't make sense. And can I just say that for the first time, and this has been a major shift, we're starting to get an internal debate in Britain about this. I mean, there was an article, for example, in the Daily Telegraph, which has been very, very strongly supportive of the war in Ukraine, which says that Trump and Macron, Starmer and Macron need to stop trying to trick Trump into maintaining maintaining this conflict in Ukraine. I mean, that this is sterile. It's an absurd policy. We need to accept that the war is going to end. If we continue the war, it will end to our further disadvantage. You're starting to get a few people on the edges start to say this. I know some people in the military are saying this. I mean, I think you've had an interview with Commodore Jeremy, for example, Steve Jeremy, and I know that he, who has written a good piece about the whole situation, he speaks to many people in the British military. I know that he does. So we're starting to see this discussion, but we have the momentum that has built up over 3 years now, that we must stick with this war. We must defeat the Russians. If we don't defeat the Russians, they'll, after they finished with, wherever they are at the moment in Ukraine, Kurakhov or Selidov or wherever, they'll come after us. So we have to go on fighting this and pushing this war. And I'm afraid many, many people in Europe and in Britain especially, unfortunately, are invested in this. So you're absolutely right. It makes no sense. I would agree with you completely. It makes no sense. But inevitably, it's going to take some time before people accept it. Accept it, by the way, I think they will. But until
It's going to be painful.
That happens, there are dangers and there are risks depending on what Donald Trump says, because you're going to have people like Starmer and earlier Macron coming along telling the Americans, give us the guarantees for the troops that we want to send to Ukraine, give us the backstop. And that, frankly, I think that would be a very dangerous thing for the United States to do and for the entire peace process.
Well, it seems that is not lost on President Trump, who does seem to be keenly aware of exactly what you just said. I want to jump back to Trump because the first clip I showed you there was from, I believe it was Monday when Macron was in town. Well, yesterday at a meeting of the cabinet, the first full meeting of the cabinet, Trump had some additional things to say about the deal, and now all of a sudden he's not quite so confident.
And I think we're going to have a deal. I can't guarantee that. A deal is a deal. Lots of crazy things happen in deals, right? But I think we're going to have a deal. If I didn't get elected, I believe he would have just continued to go through Ukraine and over a period of time. A lot of people would have been killed, would have lasted for a period of time. And the reason that Ukraine, and I have great respect for the Ukraine as fighters, they have great fighters, but without our equipment, that war would have been over, like people said, in a very short period of time.
Okay, who could argue with that? I don't think even the Europeans would argue with that. But here's the real question. If there isn't a deal, and Trump has been absolutely confident in all of his public statements so far that he could get a deal. Now all of a sudden he's like, maybe I won't get a deal, et cetera. If he doesn't get a deal, it doesn't appear that the U.S. is going to say, all right, well, we didn't get a deal, so I tell you what, we'll just keep on doing everything the Biden administration did, all this stuff indefinitely, et cetera. It seems almost no chance for that to happen. In fact, the United States is cutting stuff everywhere domestically. We're certainly not going to open a new line of credit to Kyiv, minerals or not. So the question is, if that doesn't happen, what is Europe going to do?
Well, this is exactly the problem the Europeans face, because we've had an awful lot of brave words from Europe over the last 10 days or so, that if the Americans leave, well, we can carry the slack. We can continue to support Kyiv. We can press on with the sanctions. We can continue the same policy that we've been trying for the last 3 years and which hasn't succeeded over the last 3 years. But we can go alone, do it alone. There was even an astonishing article in The Guardian which reproduced a cartoon from 1940 of a British soldier, waving his fist, and, all right, alone, we'll do it all alone. We can't do it alone. Everybody in Europe knows that we can't do it alone. We don't have the industrial capacity. We don't have the armed forces. We don't have the intelligence. We rely very, very heavily on the whole American intelligence system. We can't provide the kind of funding. Bear in mind, Europe is in a much more difficult economic situation at the moment than the US is. It may seem that, from the perspective of the US, that you have problems. The problems in Europe are much greater. Every European country has a budget crisis. Britain does, France does, Germany does. Welfare budgets have been squeezed. It's simply not possible. And at some point, that reality is going to hit home.
Pardon me for that. So one other thing that Trump said yesterday, which I think deserves some examination. He was he just said, maybe we'll get a deal, maybe we won't. But then when he was asked about Putin, you talked about how Zelensky's going to have to make some concessions. But what about Putin?
Will he have to make concessions, President Putin?
Yeah, he will. He's going to have to. And I believe that because we got elected, that war will come to an end. And I also believe if we didn't get elected, if this administration didn't win the election by a lot, that war would go on for a long time, and he would want to take the whole thing.
And he may have wanted to take the whole thing. That's debatable whether he did or didn't. I think that based on what they've been saying, they never actually wanted to take much of anything. They just wanted to have security on their borders, which they thought they could achieve with a lower cost than what it's going to turn out that they did. It's going to be a lot higher. But I think that those objectives are still unchanged about having security on their border. But with the military dynamic the way it is, especially with the Russians in the east and how their armed forces continue to get larger, now somewhere around 1.5 million. Does Putin have to give in on something?
Well, so far, the Russian position remains very strong and very unchanged. We've had statements from Lavrov, a very long set of statements the day before yesterday in a press conference in Qatar. We've had more statements today from Peskov, who's Putin's spokesman. It doesn't seem so far that the Russians are prepared to shift from the positions that Putin set out in June last year when he addressed the Russian foreign ministry. He set out his conditions. It's the 4 regions. It's Ukraine out of NATO. He wants various changes carried out to the way in which Ukraine itself is run. He wants reductions in the armed forces. It's a fairly clear set of proposals. And having said that, I think that though the Russians probably won't want to make significant concessions on those points, you have it there, Peskov, non-negotiable with regards to annexed Ukrainian territory. The Russians, nonetheless, still would want a deal done with the United States because, as we've discussed many times in these programs, and as you've just said, the key issue for them is the security of their western borders. So they might not be willing to make concessions, or at least bend much on the specific issue of what they proposed in June 2024. But that doesn't mean that they might not make concessions in other places. Concessions to the United States on disarmament. Putin says that this proposal that Trump has made to cut budgets, for example, defense budgets, it's interesting. He's prepared to look into that. But also possibly other concessions to Ukraine, maybe Russian help with Ukrainian reconstruction, for example, which would be a big thing.
Well, I think the Russians are going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make concessions. I think they're going to have to make conces
And as a negotiator, you mentioned earlier that you thought Trump might not be helping his case out by making it sound like he's too eager for a deal. But what about the mentality of thinking, oh yeah, Putin's going to have to make concessions? Because the question is, which concessions? What Trump may have in mind could be different than what Putin has in mind. So on terms of what is and isn't negotiable. So you have the potential to be setting up some, disappointed feelings or some frustrated outcomes if you think that your opponent has to give here and your opponent's thinking, no, I might give here, but I won't give you on any of this delta right here. What will that do in negotiations if Trump doesn't get what he wants and what he thinks are going to be negotiables?
Right. This brings us back to, I think it was our previous discussion about you've got to be careful conducting negotiations of this kind, and that they're different from negotiations of the kind that Trump might have been used to, where you have a very clear, very precise objective. You want to do the deal, you want to acquire the land or the building or whatever it is, and you're focused entirely on that. In this kind of process, this kind of negotiation process, you must never get angry and you must never get impatient. So you can have meetings, very, very long meetings, and it may seem that you're not making any progress at all, that the Russians are sticking very hard to their positions and they're not at the table really prepared to give. But then what you do is you go out of the room, you talk to the Russians informally. You find, well, actually, look, we're not prepared to bend on this, but might be prepared to give you that. We might be prepared to give you this, and you might be prepared to give you that. Reconstruction aid, as I said, maybe that $300 billion dollars of money that's frozen. Well, maybe we can use that in some kinds of ways that might be interesting. You gradually that way build up trust, you build up dialogue, and then over time, a deal evolves out of the negotiations. I've been in negotiations like that, and I know how that process can work. And I know that in diplomacy, it can work that way also. It used to work like that, by the way, in the strategic arms negotiations that the Americans and the Russians used to have with each other. That, again, at the table, everybody would be very rigid. But, in the back room, would talk and something would come out.
I want to go a little bit further on one of the factors you just mentioned there about trust. You can even have trust among your enemy, somebody that you're at war with and you want to have an end. In fact, I would say that it's a requirement. You've got to find some way to have some trust that each side is going to do whatever it eventually agrees to, or you may not ever get a deal at all. There seems to be such a delta between and we'll start with the Europeans primarily, what they want, how they envision this war coming to an end, and how Russia does. And that was not lost on Sergei Lavrov, who in an interview earlier today said this.
President Trump, when this topic was brought up at the press conference, said that the decision to deploy peacekeeping forces is possible only with the consent of both sides, apparently referring to us and Ukraine. No one is asking us about this. The approach being imposed by the Europeans, primarily France, as well as the British, is once again aimed at heating up the conflict further while suppressing any attempts to calm it down.
So that's how Lavrov sees it. He says, y'all are talking about ceasefires. You're talking about peacekeepers. We've said that's not going to happen, especially European peacekeepers that are part of NATO. He goes, I don't understand why y'all keep talking about this because we're not going to do that. And oh, by the way, it looks to me like Europe wants to keep the war going, not in. And I think he's referring to that meeting in Kyiv earlier this week where a number of European states offered a bunch of more money, weapons, arms systems, ammunition, etc., as opposed to, talking about diplomacy to try to bring it to an end. Can those two views be reconciled?
Well, it's going to take a huge amount of trouble, work and hard work and time. That brings us back to the original point that you made to me. Can it be done quickly in weeks? I don't see how it can. And there's trust issues, of course, between the Americans and the Russians. And that's not to be overlooked. There are people in Russia who are saying, is this all for real? Are the Americans serious about this? Is Trump serious about this? I mean, he comes along, for example, and he says that Putin has agreed and says that he has no problem with European peacekeepers. Now, I don't believe Putin said that over the course of the conversation with Trump, but here you have Trump saying that he did. Now, I think that Trump either misunderstood what Putin said or is playing some kind of game here, which perhaps it's not entirely wise for him to play. These things have to be ironed out. The Russians, for the moment, are cutting Trump an awful lot of slack. Putin is. He's taking a lot of this very, very calmly that he sees from the Americans. But rebuilding trust takes a very, very long time. And the only place that you can do it is through negotiations. And that takes time too. And those negotiations have to be conducted in a proper way and with complete good faith.
Yeah, and you see that headline, Gary, showing up right there. Russia categorically rules out any options for European peacekeepers in Ukraine. So that seems to be stillborn, and I'm not sure that that's going to work, even though apparently Keir Starmer is in town talking to Trump right now, trying to get him to agree to do that. So probably not going to have a lot of success, even if Trump agreed, which I can't imagine that he's going to. Well, the other player in this, it's also important, is Ukraine. It's ironic, and it's pretty sad that even in this discussion here, they're a distant third place. We've been talking for close to a half an hour now, and I'm just now getting to the actual combatants, which is the Ukrainian side. But there's a reason for that, and I think that that's being reflected on the global stage too. And here is what Zelensky is saying he's looking for.
З Америкою ми готуємось до перемовин вже цієї п'ятниці. Угода з Америкою, підтримка нашої держави і людей, гарантії миру та безпеки – це ключ до того, щоб Росія більше не руйнувала життя інших народів. Зустрінусь з президентом Трампом. Для мене і всіх нас у світі важливо, щоб допомога Америки не була зупинена. Сила потрібна на шляху до миру.
So for anybody who may not have been able to read those words at the bottom of the screen, basically he says he wants the U.S. to continue on supporting him. He wants something close to security guarantees from the United States, and he wants the end to be something that he's comfortable with and that will, quote, prevent Russia from ever doing this again. That is like about 180 degrees out with the view that Sergei Lavrov talked about with the June 14 terms that Putin laid out last year. Again, I guess we keep getting back to your comment there about this isn't going to be done in weeks if the two parties are this far apart.
Well, the Ukrainians obviously have to be involved in the negotiations at some point. And if I understand what Trump is trying to do, his idea is that the Russians and the Ukrainians sit down and talk, and that's it's out of that the deal comes. The Americans, in reality, will have to be involved in a very big way, and they will have to be involved with the Ukrainians specifically. And they will have to explain to the Ukrainians, look, we cannot do these things that you are asking us to do. We've already ruled out NATO membership. We're not going to give you a guarantee, therefore, that is analogous to NATO membership, because the two would contradict each other. You're asking us to commit to you in ways that we will not do and cannot do. And given that you are losing the war, there are consequences which flow from that. And eventually, again, with the Ukrainians, it's going to be very difficult with Zelensky himself, because he himself has all kinds of personal investments now in this project. I mean, this whole war, it's very difficult to see him changing his stance. But he's not the only person in Ukraine. With the Ukrainians as well, gradually over time, this may change. Now, the United States can and no doubt will play a role. But ultimately, the main guarantee for Ukraine, the thing that will give Ukraine's security and peace is a good treaty with Russia. Ukraine needs to sort out its relations with Russia, which it hasn't done, or really hasn't seriously attempted to do. And talking all the time about how the Russians are, your permanent enemy, your ultimate danger, all of that, that doesn't advance the prospect of a peace agreement. What it does, it makes it more difficult. And it makes it more difficult in the context of a war that is being lost. And as President Trump said, where the Russians have the ability to just keep going and keep going westwards until they get what they want without needing to negotiate. So I hope this is pointed out and explained to the Ukrainians at some point, because Zelensky at least doesn't seem to understand that the United States has reached its limits as to what it can do, and that Ukraine also, in its own interests, needs to start seeking peace with the Russians.
It without question, that's the case. And if there was left any doubt, there shouldn't have been, but if there was, Trump also yesterday squashed that. Not only is he not going to do NATO, he's not giving any kind of security guarantees.
Well, I'm not going to make security guarantees beyond very much. We're going to have Europe do that because it's in, we're talking about Europe as their next door neighbor. But we're going to make sure everything goes well. And as you know, we'll be making we'll be really partnering with Ukraine in terms of rare earth. We very much need rare earth. They have great rare earth. It brings us great wealth. We get back the money that we spent, and we hope that we're going to be able to settle this up. And we'll be working with Ukraine, and because we'll be taking that, we're going to be taking what we're entitled to take. It's a great deal for Ukraine, too, because they get us over there, and we're going to be working over there. We'll be on the land, and, in that way, there's sort of automatic security, because nobody's going to be messing around with our people when we're there, and so we'll be there in that way.
Okay, so this whole rare earth thing, how does that square with what the Russian view of how this thing is going to be solved? Do you see any room for that? Because if Trump is telling Ukraine, I don't got any security guarantees, but I am going to keep, mining all of these rare earths and all kinds of other important things. If the Russians are going to have the June 14 lines or something more to the west.
Well, the only way this rare earth thing can work is that if there is peace with Russia. So this gives the United States, if they're really serious about this, I'm not absolutely sure whether they are or not, but on the assumption that they are serious with this, they need now that peace agreement with Russia. It gives the Russians, in a kind of way, more leverage over the Americans, because the Americans say, or at least Trump is saying, he wants to get America's money back. And the Russians, who will have no problems, by the way, if the peace is done, with the Americans being in Ukraine and extracting whatever it is that they can extract, the Russians will say, well, that's fine. But, in order to get there, we need to sort out all these other very important issues: the status of the 4 regions, the size of the Ukrainian army, the situation of, the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, all of those other things. So, again, I'm not sure whether President Trump quite understands this, but he is actually going forward into a negotiation, giving more cards for the Russians to play. I'm not saying this is, from an American point of view, in the long term, a bad thing. I'm not sure that this deal, I've seen the deal, I've read it, I'm not sure that it's particularly good for Ukraine, just saying. But I could see, that the Americans might be keen to get something back for all the money that they've spent on Ukraine. But that takes us back to the starting point. You can only do that if you have a deal with the Russians.
And I think that throughout this whole episode here, you have very effectively drawn the picture. This is probably not going to be over within a few weeks, because the views of the United States side, the European side, and the Ukraine side are just vast ocean away from the Russian side. The Russian side has the military capacity to compel submission on its side and win by force of arms what it wants if it doesn't get them in negotiations. It has no real motivation to negotiate anything away from a position of power. And so this could take a long time. Here's the biggest problem with that, though, is the Ukrainian people. This report here I'm going to show you it's going to show one town of what the devastation of the last 3 years has achieved.
Memorials of fallen soldiers line the main square of Kyiv. The photos capture their faces in happier times. Above them, a slogan that has become one of the defining mantras of this war: glory to the heroes. Kyiv is more than 600 kilometers from the front lines, yet few places illustrate the deep impact of this war as vividly. Here, men of military age exist only in photographs or in the lonely graves of the town cemetery. Everyone else is gone.
And that's one town, but those kinds of scenes are repeated all over the place, especially the closer to the line of contact you get. And we've already seen from General Sirski has admitted publicly that even with this force mobilization, they don't have enough to offset losses. So they're continuing to shrink in capacity by the day, and of course, even in capability among those that are forced into uniform. They all see the news. They all see where this is going. They see Trump saying that we're not going to support you guys indefinitely, and I think this could be over with weeks. So you're asking them to continue to fight and die every day for a loss. Maybe the loss will be here, maybe it'll be here, but it's going to be a loss, and the war is going to be over. So why do you want to be the last one to fight? And then on the other side, you have this Russian behemoth's getting bigger and stronger, and their morale is going through the roof from all the sources that I can see. If this drags out, Alexander, will the Ukraine army continue to be able to hold out until some kind of agreement that's agreeable to Kyiv is sought?
Well, that's the absolutely key point, because ultimately it can't. There has to be, if Ukraine is going to survive, if the sacrifice of all of those men is going to mean something, which is now very much bound out with Ukraine surviving, there has to be peace. And you cannot go on feeding more and more men from across Ukraine into this terrible war and expect that there won't be a catastrophic effect on Ukraine and its society at the end of it if that war is not negotiated. It is terrible that it's gone on for so long. And I have to say this, you can make all kinds of comments about President Trump, but he is the first Western leader who does at least talk about the tragedy of this. And that is entirely commendable. And it astonishes me that people have not observed that and commented on it as much as they have done, because he's absolutely right when he says about all of these people dying and what a tragedy that is. He is absolutely right. And Ukrainian leaders also need to understand, and they need to listen to their own commanders and listen to the situation in their amongst their soldiers, that they can't continue with this sacrifice indefinitely, even if they were to get the support from the Europeans and even the Americans that they want to.
Yeah, and that's what just is anguishing me. We've talked about it probably every time we're on here, is that the pointless human carnage is just egregious to me, because it's permanent. It's not that some people are wounded, lost limbs, apparently scores of thousands that'll be living with us for the rest of their lives. But all these other families, it's permanent. They can never get them back, and generations have been sacrificed. That even if the war ends today, and they just said, yeah, Putin, whatever you want, you got it all right now. Here, I'll sign this blank check. The damage done is incalculable. But the longer we drag it on, it's hard to believe it can actually get worse. But the end is already known. We know how it's going to end, but we'll see what happens with that. Listen, before I let you go today, I would like your opinion on a related topic, and that is about NATO. Our Secretary of State Rubio was interviewed yesterday, And he was asked about where are things with the United States and NATO right now? How do we want to see that thing play out? Here's how it went.
NATO is not in jeopardy. The only thing that puts NATO in jeopardy is the fact that we have NATO allies who barely have militaries, or whose militaries are not very capable because they've spent 40 years not spending any money on it. We've been NATO. And all President Trump has argued is what every president, every American president has argued for the last 30 years, and that is these are rich countries, especially in Western Europe. They have plenty of money. They should be investing that in their national security, and they're not. You have countries spending 1.5%, 1% of their economy, and we just can't keep subsidizing that. It's not fair, and it's not sustainable.
Do you think that message is going to get through to Europe? Because the question is, what is Trump going to do about it if he doesn't? Now, to be fair, the NATO, I think like 20 of the countries have gotten to the 2%, but even that is not really what's necessary for their national security. I see the UK just announced yesterday they're going to increase to 2.5%, which is kind of incremental. It's not a whole lot more. And we've done some analysis that shows that combat capability is going to be also incrementally changed if everything works right. It's not going to really add a lot to it. And a lot of other countries aren't even doing that. Is there some justification that individual countries aren't worried about their own national security enough?
Well, of course there is, because I mean, the reality of NATO, and I think, by the way, the Americans are making a valid point, that the reality of NATO for a very long time was that the Europeans didn't spend a large amount of money on NATO. This was true even during the later years of the Cold War, by the way, because if they spent too much money on NATO, on their own militaries, well, the Americans might say to themselves, well, do we really need to be here? Because the Europeans can take care of all of this all by themselves. Now, Americans don't know this, but I know those discussions have taken place certainly in Britain. So, it's that there has been this factor as well. Now, I don't actually think that there is very much room, fiscal room, in European societies at the moment to spend huge amounts of money, additional money on the military. European society has become very, very civilianized. Young men don't want to serve in the militaries to the extent that is still the case in the United States, and which was formerly the case in Europe. We've also got very, very expensive welfare systems, which have many people who benefit from them, and they're going to resist every attempt to try to cut back on those benefits. And of course, we have budgetary problems across Europe, and we have sagging economies as well. So how do you square this circle? The Americans want Europe to spend more on its own defense. The Europeans probably aren't able to spend that much more on defense. It's very simple. You do a deal with Russia. The secret of politics, as Bismarck once said, is a good treaty with Russia. You can then keep NATO. You don't have to spend that much money on defense in Europe, and the Americans can reduce their position in Europe as well, because they don't need to worry about the Russians. They can go back home to the extent that they want to, because I think the Americans probably will always want to keep some kind of a presence in Europe. But anyway, they can go back home to the extent that they want to, and they know that if they go, there will be peace. And the Russians also want peace, because why would they not? Why would they want to invade Europe? Why would they want to run places like Birmingham or Surrey?
Well, in fact, I wanted to ask you that question. So for all of the rhetoric among it, and I've seen it all over the place. I saw it in Kyiv with all the European leaders yesterday, and really for the duration of this war. Russia, as soon as they get rid of Ukraine, is rolling to the west. They're going to come after us, and we got to stop them here, and all this kind of nonsense. But when you look at what they're actually doing, to your comment earlier in this show, words are one thing, actions are another. And they're not putting, I mean, some NATO countries actually are 1.2% of their national security or their GDP on national security. That tells me with actions that they don't really think Russia is going to be rolling to the west, or they would be doing a whole lot more than they are.
Well, that's exactly the point, because, of course, if Europeans really believed that, the Russian behemoth was coming to take over Europe for whatever incomprehensible reason the Russians had for wanting to do that. Then, of course, attitudes would change, and they would change very radically. And there would be support right across Europe amongst European publics for higher defense spending. And European politicians wouldn't hesitate. And that lack of involvement in the militaries that we've seen in Europe would come back. But of course, people in Europe don't really believe that. So make peace. It's not actually that complicated. You can still have NATO, by the way. The Russians, this is the thing people never understand. They don't want to see NATO go. They don't want the Americans to leave. They would. I'm not saying anything that is a secret or a mystery. Many Russians have spoken about this in many times. We'd rather have the Americans in Europe than have the Germans, for example, going off, rearming, acquiring nuclear weapons, or doing those kind of things. So there is a grand deal to be done if we have the imagination to do it.
And that benefits everyone. Everyone.
It benefits everyone, exactly.
That's fascinating. I hope that drive for ultimate self-interest prevails, and we get just such a grand bargain, because it's definitely there to be had. Last question I got for you. One of our viewers just put this up, and I thought it was interesting because I've seen it before. What's your thought on this? Will Trump be offered the Nobel Peace Prize for ending a war like Obama was starting for them in the event that he gets this over?
Well, if he does, he deserves it. I would say. I mean, this has been a disaster for Europe. We talked about all those awful pictures of all those, photographs of all those dead people, the horrible sights in the cemeteries. If he's able to bring the war to an end and restore peace, he deserves a Nobel Peace Prize more than any other European statesman since the Second World War. Whether the Nobel Prize Committee would award it to him is, of course, an entirely different matter. I think collectively, they're the sort of people who probably don't like Donald Trump, and it might be difficult to persuade them. But
because
whether he
I'm
deserves
sure that they
it
would,
or not.
Yeah, what they would do, no question. And we already see it lining up. We've seen it in the United States. We've seen it among the Democratic Party. They're already setting up. No matter what kind of deal Trump comes up with, it will immediately be a Tolstoy stab in the back deal, the capitulation, you surrendered. It's 1938, Munich again, all that kind of stuff. They're already saying, that he's surrendering to Russia. So there will be that pressure against getting the Nobel Peace Prize. But honestly, if the killing stops and the threat of expanded war ends, people can say whatever they want, I guess.
Absolutely, and absolutely correct. And by the way, the original stab in the back myth was fabricated in Germany after the First World War. And as a military man, you know that the reality was that Germany lost. It actually was defeated on the battlefield. So, we shouldn't revive the lies of the past to suit the politics of the present. It's completely wrong. Actually, Putin put it very, very well. He gave an interview just a few days ago to a Russian journalist who's basically a friend of his, in which he said that what Trump is actually trying to do is preserve Ukraine. It's all set out. It's the last interview he did with Pavel Zarubin. And Putin said, well, that's what the Americans want to do. That's what Donald Trump wants to do. Our interests and his on this don't entirely correspond, but we understand what he's trying to do, and we also will go with it because peace, a wider peace, is in our interests too.
Wow. Well, that's any kind of common ground is get. And again, I just reiterate over and over, any agreement that gets the killing stopped and removes or reduces the chance for expanded war is something we should be going after. And it's been a puzzle to me why no one of any value other than Viktor Orban and Robert Fico have been trying to get this war over. And I still give great kudos to those two men who have been stalwarts from the beginning when it was very unpopular in Europe. I wish more would follow their lead.
I completely agree.
Well, thank you so much for coming on today. It's always a treasure to have you on. And this episode shows why, because you have such great insights here. And we'll be tracking this stuff and seeing where it goes. And we'll look forward to having you on very soon in the near future.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and I'm very much looking forward to it.
Very good. Thank you guys for joining us too. Also, let you know we got another show coming up here in a little while. We're going to have Colonel Jacques Beau, one of our most popular guests, also from a military perspective, former NATO officer, 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, Washington time. Ending war proposals, there is a huge divide. We've talked about a little bit of it here. We're going to get into more of that with Colonel Beau and figure out what we can do to narrow the gap. Don't forget to join us then and like and subscribe if you haven't done that. And we'll look forward to seeing you in about 45 minutes on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.